An alien threat has risen from beyond the abyss, a swarm so vast that it blots out the stars. This horror fights for neither power nor territory, but rather to feed a hunger so insatiable that it will eventually devour the entire galaxy.
In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the million-planet Imperium of Man struggles to survive against untold horrors. From the savagery of the Orks to the upstarts in the Tau Empire, from the deathless mechanical Necrons to the ever-present threat of chaos corruption, the Imperium and her people find themselves locked in near endless conflict, eternally fighting to survive in the name of their God Emperor. But for all the terrors they face, there are few as horrifying and dangerous as the Great Devourer itself, the vicious swarms of the Tyranids. Greetings and salutations, friends and gamers of all stripes. My name is GM Dave, I am your man behind the screen, and welcome to the third installment of the Bestiary. Today we break away from the realms of Dungeons & Dragons and move towards the terrible future presented in the epic sci-fi fantasy universe of Warhammer 40,000. Our subject today, the horrid Tyranids, a race of biomechanical alien monstrosities whose sole purpose is to consume, adapt, and survive. Now, unlike our previous two entries in the Bestiary covering Blue Dragons and Glabrazu, our examination of the Tyranids is not going to look at a single specific creature underneath their umbrella. The reason for this quite simply is because it's not really possible to analyze just one Tyranid bioform without understanding how the species as a whole behaves, and that is our goal here today. We will be taking a deep dive into the Tyranids, looking at their origins in history, biology, strategy and tactics, and finally, finishing off with an interesting hypothesis and some closing thoughts. So, friends and gamers, without any further ado, I invite you to join me as we examine the interstellar terror that is, the Tyranids. The full history of these hideous Xenos is largely unknown to the Imperium for a few reasons. Firstly, the simple fact of the matter is that compared to many of the other threats the Imperium faces, the Tyranids are a fairly recent one. Secondly, the Tyranids as a life form think and behave in a manner that is as far from human as possible, behaving more as a swarm of intergalactic planet-devouring locusts. First encountered in the year 745 of the 41st millennium within the eastern fringes of the Milky Way galaxy, the hostility of the Tyranids was immediately apparent. Emerging from the depths of space around the planet Tyron Primus, this first Hive Fleet, as they're called, descended upon the planet from orbit, a massive swarm of varied and specialized life forms whose incredible numbers moved in unison. Their mission was simple: annihilate and consume all valuable biomass on the planet, converting everything possible into an easily digestible base element that could then be used to further evolve the swarm. What remained of the largely aquatic planet was an empty rock, devoid even of its atmosphere. Everything that could be converted for use by the Hive Fleet had been. Nothing was left. Thanks to the immensely vast reach of the Imperium, it took some time before anyone realized what happened to Tyron Primus. By the time someone took notice, likely due more to the fact that their taxes were no longer being paid than any lack of actual communication, and the Imperial Inquisition was sent to investigate, the Tyranid menace had already moved on to continue its swathe of destruction towards the heart of the Imperium. And indeed, this Hive Fleet, now designated Hive Fleet Behemoth, cut deep. It wasn't until they reached the planet Ultramar, home of the Imperium's mighty Ultramarines, that the Hive Fleet Behemoth was destroyed, but not without massive losses to the Imperium's largest Space Marine chapter. Indeed, the losses were so great that they took centuries to replenish. Unfortunately for the Imperium, as well as the other races of the galaxy, it didn't take long for them to learn that the threat hadn't been vanquished. In the year 942 of Millennium 41, it was discovered by Imperial Commissar Caiaphas Cain that the Tyranid presence had existed in the galaxy for far longer than anyone had expected. While on mission upon the ice world Nusquam Fundamentibus, Commissar Cain found a Tyranid swarm hibernating in the permafrost, left there by a hive ship that crash-landed on the planet thousands of years prior. His unit's discovery led to the swarm reawakening, and though it was eventually defeated, the Imperial Inquisition was made very nervous when they discovered they'd been frozen there since at least Millennium 35, dating their presence in the galaxy to the pre-Imperium era. 51 years after this discovery, in 993 of Millennium 41, the Tyranids returned again with Hive Fleet Kraken. However, unlike Hive Fleet Behemoth before it, Kraken didn't assault its target as a single massed fleet. Instead, it branched into smaller fleets and moved to envelop whole star systems before the reinforcements could arrive. This new divide and conquer strategy worked well for Hive Fleet Kraken, forcing two Space Marine chapters, the size of the Emperor and the Lamenters, to take on the bulk of the attack. In fact, this tactic worked so well that it nearly resulted in the total destruction of the size of the Emperor. Ultimately, similar to Behemoth before it, Hive Fleet Kraken would be broken, this time by its defeats at the Battle of Ikar IV and the Eldar Craftworld Iyanden. However, in spite of this defeat, the losses of both the Imperium and the Craftworld Iyanden were massive, and the remnants of the Hive Fleet Kraken broke off into smaller fleets to further assail the galaxy, ranging as far as the borders of the upstart Tau Empire. But the Great Devourer was still not finished. A scant 4 years later came Hive Fleet Leviathan, appearing unexpectedly below the galaxy, which is to say on the lower end of the galaxy's z-axis. Leviathan reached up and attacked the galaxy from two key points that largely cut the heart of the Imperium off from its reinforcements. However, just when it appeared that the defenses of the Segmentum Solar, which comprises our own solar system and the heart of the Imperium, would be put to the test, a stroke of fortune saw Hive Fleet Leviathan distracted and deflected by the presence of a massive Ork empire in a nearby solar system. And yet, though the Orks are managing to stall the advance of the Hive Fleet's main branch, it is likely that Leviathan will eventually emerge victorious and stronger than before, its ranks bolstered as it absorbs the powerful genetic material of the Greenskins. And so we can see that the Tyranids are an especially deadly foe. But why? What are these alien monstrosities really? And where do they come from?
The Tyranids are without a doubt the most rapidly evolving creatures in the galaxy. The Magos biologists of Mars have observed developmental DNA leaps that would take other beasts millions of years to achieve. It appears that the Tyranid Norn queens or progenitor organisms aboard the hive ships are capable of modifying their progeny in response to the environment and life forms they encounter. Newly harvested genetic codes are assimilated, the prey's defensive measures are examined, and improved creatures are bioengineered to overcome that resistance. Over time, the myriad improvements to the Hive Fleet's gene pool are melded with others, strengthening the entire race.
Now that we've very briefly explored the history of the Tyranids' violent interactions with the Imperium, which should hint to you how absurdly expansive the lore of Warhammer 40,000 is, I'm sure the question lingering on your lips is what these monstrosities actually are. Where did the Hive Fleets come from? How do they communicate and interact with each other? How is it they can fight so effectively against the myriad other deadly forces of the 41st millennium? While there is some small debate regarding the actual origins of the Tyranids, the most widely accepted hypothesis is that they're an extragalactic species who migrated to the Milky Way from one or more of her neighboring galaxies. Exactly why they did this remains unknown, but there are two ideas that are widely accepted within the Imperium, ideas that are often argued in tandem. One, wherever they originally came from, the all-consuming Tyranids already absorbed all the available biomass, forcing them to move to the newest source of readily available biomass to further their evolution and survival. That source just so happened to be the Milky Way galaxy. 2. The highly psychically sensitive Tyranids sense the psychic energies of the Astronomicon, the powerful psychic beacon the Imperium uses to assist with long-range psychic communication between their million worlds and enable relatively safe, faster-than-light travel through the wildly dangerous immaterial space of the warp. Speaking of psychic sensitivity, this is one of the key traits that makes the Tyranid swarm such an effective and devastating menace not only to the Imperium, but all forms of life in the galaxy. This is because of two distinct psychic traits shared amongst the myriad Tyranid bioforms, the hive mind and the synapse. Now, the hive mind is pretty much exactly what you'd think it is, a shared psychic consciousness present in all Tyranid bioforms. However, the strength of influence the various bioforms can exert through the hive mind is anything but equal. Ultimate say over a hive fleet's approach to any scenario falls entirely to its Norn queens, the progenitor organisms that birth all of the various other bioforms. As such, their control of the hive mind is all but absolute, but the Norn queens by themselves don't have the psychic strength to enforce their will across their swarms alone. This will must be maintained lest lesser bioforms such as Rippers, Hormigons, and Termagants revert to the chaotic drives of base instinct, something that would be disastrous for a species that predicates itself on sharply focused tactics meant to overwhelm. Because of this, Tyranid broods always field multiple bioforms of a higher ranking, as it were, that can more directly exert the will of the hive mind. Tyranid warriors and the feared and horrifying hive tyrants are among the most common of these, but powerful psychers like the hideously malformed Zoanthrope or the massive and vicious Dominatrix are equally, if not more, capable of enforcing this will as well. By spreading the hive mind's influence in this manner, the hive fleets are much better able to maintain control of all bioforms present on the battlefield. Now, the flip side to this phenomenon, the synapse, is a little bit more difficult to explain. In simplest terms, the synapse is a set of instinctual and reactive behaviors that enable Tyranid fleets and swarms to function in perfect unison. Think of a school of fish or a flock of birds moving in unison to avoid threats that they're detecting. However, while this explanation scratches the surface of what the synapse entails, it's ultimately a gross oversimplification. And so, to be more specific, the synapse is akin to a web of psychic influences and feedback that is transmitted through and coordinated by the hive mind. All Tyranid bioforms affect the synapse, and all are affected by the synapse in kind. This makes the synaptic web tumultuous by nature, a cacophony of collective brainpower from a mass organism that at times is larger than most planets. So much information is constantly transmitted back and forth across this web that each creature disseminating it all individually would be crippling to the swarm. To combat this issue, the task is relegated to various synapse creatures, specialized bioforms whose more advanced brains can function like psychic routers and hubs, enabling them to coordinate and police the cacophony that is the synapse. These organisms are invaluable to the swarm, as without the localized control they provide, the swarm can falter rapidly, sometimes leading to the previously mentioned reversion to animalistic behaviors exhibited by some of the lesser bioforms. And as is expected of any creature that can control such powerful psychic phenomenon, most, if not all, of the synapse creatures are potent psychers in their own rights, such as the previously mentioned Zoanthrope and Dominatrix. But while the hive-minded synapse are what enable the Tyranids to act as one, even without a command structure, they alone aren't what make the Tyranids such a destructive force. It's the bioforms themselves, focused into uniform action by the hive-minded synapse that do this, for the Tyranids aren't just a species of spacefaring, planet-eating bugs. They are, in many ways, a prime example of the power of evolution, as well as a dark and vicious mockery of it. With all the variety the Tyranid bioforms display in terms of their size, strength, appearance, and capabilities, one might think these creatures to be an amalgam of different species working in unison under a symbiotic relationship of sorts. Those who would take to such notions would be mistaken, as all Tyranid bioforms, from the Spore Mine to the Carnifex, share the same genetic core. Remember, every one of the varied Tyranid bioforms is birthed by the Norn Queens of their hive fleets. This means that the Norn Queens hold the base DNA strands present across the brood, quite literally making them the heart of their swarms. If the Norn Queen were to die, or worse, be captured, then not only would the genetic core of the brood be lost, but, assuming their captors had the know-how, a captured Norn Queen could potentially have her DNA used to develop a virus that could annihilate her swarm at the genetic level. Because of this, the Norn Queens are fiercely protected, usually kept at the center of both her bioship and high fleet to ensure the greatest level of protection for her. So how then do the Tyranids achieve such variety within their ranks? The answer is much like that of the Star Trek's Borg: assimilation. As the Tyranids traverse the stars, consuming planets along the way, they absorb the genetic material of the various life forms they devoured. This collective mass of genetic material, dubbed biomass, then has the most desirable traits extracted from it and incorporated into the Tyranid gene pool. It may enhance their combat abilities, make the consumption of planetary biomass more efficient, or just do something as simple as improve the growth rates of the different bioforms. The point is, if a genetic trait will improve the swarm, they will find a way to incorporate it. As for how this is done, it all comes down to careful genetic engineering. Indeed, the Tyranids are arguably the most advanced genetic engineers in the galaxy, if not the universe, and the wealth of genetic information they've gathered whilst traversing the stars has enabled them to adapt their bioforms to fulfill just about any role they could need. But when push comes to shove, and in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, it comes to shove more often than not, it's the combat capabilities of the swarm that matter most of all, and the Tyranids do not lack in this respect. All combat-bred Tyranids are deadly. It's just a matter of how efficient they are at being deadly. And while the lesser bioforms technically are the least efficient in this regard on an individual scale, it would be a grave mistake to underestimate them. Now, since it is genetic engineering that results in this variety of specialized life forms, the primary weapons of most Tyranids is exactly what one would probably expect: their own teeth and claws. But make no mistake, these are still incredibly effective, as an utterly absurd amount of genetic manipulation goes into making these natural killing tools as efficient as possible. Throwing something of a perceived wrench into this idea is the fact that some bioforms seem to carry massive bone swords or biomechanical firearms. Though these might appear to be carried, they are in fact, more often than not, part of the bioform's body, and oftentimes are fused into the carrying limb. Defensively speaking, the Tyranids rely on thick hides, bone plates, and carapaces of thick chitin to protect themselves, with the density and strength depending on the bioform. Generally speaking, lesser bioforms will sport thickened hides with some bone plating, good for protecting from small arms fire, but largely ineffective against anything with a serious punch behind it. The larger and more powerful bioforms tend towards stronger chitinous shells, a more advanced form of protection befitting their higher value to the swarm. Thickening the shell into a carapace will turn these more massive bioforms into a sort of living tank, with these carapaces often being tougher even than Imperial ceramite. Appropriately, the bioforms that support such carapaces tend to be the ones with the size and strength necessary to rip through the heavy armor of enemy vehicles or siege-fortified defensive positions. Now, as mentioned earlier, while many of the Tyranids do rely on their own teeth and claws to overtake their enemies, they don't solely rely on melee combat to achieve their aim. Some wield biomechanical firearms, although calling these firearms is something as a misnomer, as these weapons more often tend to use pressurized gases or muscular contractions to launch their projectiles. Projectiles that themselves are bioengineered terrors in their own right. Sometimes these are relatively simple things such as chitinous spurs or spikes, but more often these projectiles involve some sort of virulent poison or highly caustic acid meant to rapidly break down organic and inorganic matter alike. Arguably the most horrifying Tyranid projectile weapons are the ones that themselves are living creatures, such as the borer beetle, who, as the name suggests, will bore their way through their targets, eating their way inside them and then back out again over and over. Indeed, combat against the Tyranids only becomes a more frightening prospect when one realizes that it largely involves a massive swarm of rending teeth, ripping claws, and oozing poisons and acids. Do not forget, though, the Tyranids have more at their disposal than just these physical horrors. They are a psychically sensitive species, and as such field hosts of powerful psykers as well. However, where most psykers draw their power from the warp, the Tyranids do not, even while using similar abilities such as warp blasts. This also means that in spite of the immense psychic presence they have, Tyranids don't draw upon or attract the corrupting forces of chaos present in the warp, and why this is remains unknown and is hotly debated. But interestingly, having no psychic tie to the warp also means that the Tyranids aren't able to enter the warp to achieve faster than light transit the way Imperial starships can. This might lead one to assume that they're only capable of sublight travel, and whilst it's true that they can only achieve sublight speeds while in a planetary system's gravitic boundaries, the rapidity with which they traverse the galaxy belies the fact that they do possess some means to achieve superliminal speed. This ability relies on a small, highly specialized bioship called a narval. These bioships stand out from the rest in two major ways. Firstly, they are nearly defenseless, sporting only a very thin protective carapace and a handful of bioweaponry. Secondly, their specialization. The narval is the only bioform capable of enabling superliminal travel for Tyranid hive fleets. The narval manages this feat by first surveying prospective planetary systems. Using a series of monofilaments on its bow, the narval takes in an enormous variety of sensory inputs, including a broad spectrum of electromagnetic and gravimetric signals. With these sensitive sensor organs, the narval is able to scan for and detect new planetary systems at extreme distances. Then, once a system is detected, it uses that system's own gravity field to form a compressed space-time corridor, which the Hive Fleet then essentially falls into in order to traverse massive interstellar distances. How the narval manages this manipulation of gravity isn't understood, but it can have some incredibly negative effects on planets within a target system, up to and including the collapse of the cores of the target planet, leading to a host of natural disasters such as earthquakes and extreme storms. However, as devastating as this can be to a planet's population, it's arguably a minor inconvenience compared to the major psychic influence the arrival of a hive fleet has on a planetary system. This effect, generated by the overwhelming presence of the hive mind, is known amongst the Imperium as the Shadow in the Warp, and its effect can ultimately be devastating for an Imperium planet within the presence of a hive fleet. The Shadow in the Warp is essentially a powerful psychic dampening effect emitted by the Hive fleets thanks to the constant psychic activity of the Tyranid hive mind. Whether or not this is created deliberately or passively is unknown, but the effect is crippling for Imperium worlds who rely so heavily on psychic communication and travel through the warp. The result of this effect, which is described as being akin to a psychic static, is the disruption of all psychic communication and warp-based travel, not just for the Imperium, but any races who use such things. Systems affected by the Shadow in the Warp go deathly silent to the outside galaxy as they are rendered incapable of reporting on either the horror they're about to encounter or whatever nightmares may already be unfolding on the surface of their world. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the Shadow in the Warp has the added effect of creating panic and fear in affected populations wherever it appears. A sense of foreboding dread descends into the minds of those living upon an affected prey world and has the potential to plunge the entire planetary population into despair. These effects are worse still for races with high psychic capacity such as the Eldar, or for any psykers unfortunate enough to be caught within the phenomenon, as the miserable effects are magnified tenfold. So devastating is the Shadow in the Warp that if a psyker were to use their otherworldly abilities while affected, the mental discordance will worsen as the psychic noise of billions of incomprehensible alien thoughts scratch at their mind, pitching all but the strongest-willed psykers into complete insanity. Knowing this, it's easy to see why races like the Imperium of Man, who make frequent use of specialized psykers such as astropaths and navigators to assist in communication and warp travel, consider the Shadow in the Warp to be one of the worst aspects of the Tyranid swarm. Bereft of their chief method of calling for reinforcements or the ability to safely navigate the surrounding space, Imperium worlds within the Shadow quickly find themselves isolated from the wider galaxy. Ultimately, this means that by the time the Shadow in the Warp falls, these planets are already out of time. Effectively on their own, they are left with no choice. Defend themselves against the swarm with the arms and armor they have on hand, or die trying.
To think that the Tyranids are mindless beasts is a grave mistake. When you fight the Tyranids, you face not only those before you on the battlefield, but the untold thousands which seek to surround you, which attack your supporting units and destroy your supply lines in perfect synchronicity. These aliens have shown evidence of both tactics and strategy that speaks of a far worse threat than any posed by a mere beast.
Though the individual tactics used in a planetary invasion can and often will differ in relatively minute aspects between Tyranid hive fleets, those aspects most often being when, where, and how different bioforms are utilized in the attacks, the core strategy used by the Tyranid species remains largely unchanged. And while the core of a Tyranid assault strategy is to overwhelm a prey world's inhabitants with numbers so massive as to be uncountable, this is only one step along the path towards consuming a planet's biomass. Ultimately, the master strategy of the Tyranid swarm can be broken down into 5 steps: infiltration, infestation, assault, suppression, and finally, consumption. The infiltration stage is the first step for any Tyranid attack. This involves the use of 3 distinct bioforms: Vanguard drone ships, lictors, and gene stealers, all of which are unique amongst the Tyranid hive mind as they are specially engineered to operate with a degree of autonomy most other bioforms are never permitted. These bioforms are further distinguished by the unique roles each of them plays in the lead-up to a hive fleet assault. Of these, the Vanguard drone ship is the least unique, as it is simply a Tyranid bioship specialized for stealth and scouting. Vanguard drones travel far ahead of the hive fleets, scouting out worlds suitable for infestation. If one finds a suitable world, it will then seed it with lictor and gene stealer bioforms, thus beginning the infiltration in earnest. It may then return to share what it's learned with the hive fleet, but more likely will keep moving on to scout and seed new worlds, only returning once it needs to replenish its stock of lictors, gene stealers, and nutrition. Lictors, on the other hand, are the masters of stealth and reconnaissance on the ground. When a Vanguard drone ship finds a suitable world, it will often deposit 1 or more lictors onto that world to scout out the planet's surface. Lictors are incredibly well suited for this job too, with their chameleonic cells allowing them to blend so well with their surroundings that they become all but invisible. Couple this with their uncanny ability to move swiftly with near total silence through even the most dense terrains, and it becomes clear that lictors are true masters of stealth and speed. Strangely, lictors don't use psychic signals to transmit what they've learned to a Vanguard drone or hive fleet. Instead, once they've located and begun hunting their prey, they leave a trail of lingering pheromones that will attract other Tyranids to its location once they make planetfall. Lictors are assisted in their hunting and reconnaissance capabilities by the sensitive tentacles that grow out of their faces. Yes, you heard that correctly. The massive tentacles that grows out of a lictor's face is not meant for grasping prey to make it easier to eat them. Rather, these sensitive organs are used to scan the area for physiological information in a manner similar to how the narwhal uses its monofilaments to scan for planets, though the lictor's tentacles obviously are not nearly as powerful in their sensitivity. Fortunately for any worlds playing host to lictors, the efficacy of these bioforms is limited to the areas they are able to physically explore, and planets are large places for solitary aliens to scout the surface of on foot. This means that even if a lictor does land somewhere near a notable settlement, near being a relative term on the planetary scale, it can take months, years, or even decades before they find anything of notable worth to them. Unfortunately, the same is not true of the Gene Stealers. Gene Stealers are, without a doubt, the primary core of the infiltration stage, and they are the bioforms that will begin the initial steps towards infestation. Frequently seated on space hulks, massive derelict spacecraft that the Imperium find immensely valuable, or similar secluded vessels or planetary regions, the Gene Stealers will scout every inch of wherever they've been deposited to familiarize themselves with their new home. Once this is accomplished, they will enter hibernation, waking only when suitable prey lifeforms have been encountered. Most frequently, these lifeforms will involve the intelligent races of the galaxy, be they man, Tau, Eldar, or Ork. The Gene Stealers waste no time in attacking these lifeforms, occasionally killing some but always leaving at least one alive to be implanted with a seed. This seed is actually a form of gene-stealer reproductive virus containing strains of specially engineered Tyranid DNA. This virus is non-lethal by design, as its goal is not to kill the host but rather spark the early stages of planetary infestation. As such, the virus will subtly alter the host's DNA, producing a strong urge to mate created by stimulating the host's sex hormones. This DNA is then incorporated into the reproductive cells, meaning any child conceived by the host will result in a gene-stealer hybrid which has complete loyalty to its parents through a powerful psychic bond. How exactly this method of reproductive infestation works with the asexual orcs has never been explained to my knowledge, but I would imagine that the most likely scenario is that the infected orcs will simply spread these genes as they naturally spore in the areas that they reside in. More on that in a later video. From this point, the hybrids continue breeding and multiplying amongst the population of the host species until a gene-stealer cult is eventually formed. As the cult's numbers grow, it begins to spread its influence throughout a prey world's political and social structures, planting members of the cult into positions of power amongst regional governments and militaries of target planets. It's during this time that the cults will also emit a collective psychic signal through the warp, a beacon meant to call the Hive Fleet to them. Then, as the fleet nears the prey world, the cult, which may potentially number in the millions by this point, becomes fully active, instigating global rebellion and unrest with the aim of weakening the planet's defenses before the Hive ships arrive. It's with the coming of the Hive ship and its escort that the second stage, infestation, begins in earnest. This is also when the shadow of the warp phenomenon first appears, as the Hive ship, itself a powerful node of the Hive mind, projects this psychic cacophony over a radius of several light years. Once a Hive ship comes within range of a planet, it begins the next step of the invasion by launching pods called mycetic spores towards the planet's surface. These pods rain devastation down onto the planet as they release their cargo. Sometimes this takes the form of Tyranid microbials, hostile microorganisms that begin immediately altering a planet's atmosphere, soil, oceans, flora, and fauna by breaking down complex molecules to better suit them for absorption by the swarm. The rest of the spores play host to the more complex Tyranid bioforms. Some, such as gargoyles and the various types of gaunts, immediately begin preparation for the assaults to come, while other more massive strains burrow deeper into the planet's crust. As these creatures burrow, they leave behind spores which can later grow into the massive capillary towers the Hive Fleet uses to drain planets of their resources. Additionally, these massive tunnels provide other bioforms access to a planet's mineral wealth, as well as any subterranean life that may be present within their shelter. As the mycetic spores rain down from the skies, the lictors and gene-stealers already infesting the world reveal themselves. Using both the knowledge they obtained and the hybrid life they spawned, they will begin the process of sowing confusion through the ranks of the prey world's defenders. Selective targeting of military leadership and communications hubs is a preferred and devastating tactic for these infiltrators, one that can delay or even fully compromise a planet's defenses. As can be expected, a planet's defenders must act swiftly during this stage of attack, lest they be left in a truly hopeless scenario. Decisive action is required here, and that often means attempting to find a way to cut off the attack at its source. After all, destruction of the Hive ship will throw the rest of the swarm into confusion and chaos, rendering them much easier to deal with. Because of this, the infestation stage can be argued to be the highest risk stage for an attacking swarm. However, if infestation is successful, the Tyranids then move to full assault against the planet's remaining defenses. With their foothold established, nigh endless swarms of lesser bioforms, gargoyles, gaunts, and gene-stealers largely, rampage through sky, land, and sea to scour the world of resistance. Intermingled with these are the more massive bioforms, including Carnifexes, Tyrannofexes, and sometimes even gargantuan biotitans like Hierophants and Haradons. These many varied bioforms come together to sweep across the planet in gargantuan battle lines that are sometimes hundreds of kilometers wide. Behind the sweeping swarm, the massive capillary towers begin to burst out of the planet's surface, reaching up thousands of meters into the atmosphere and beyond. These towers will consolidate the biomass already collected by the initial infestation, using it to breed new bioforms and further bolster the already massive numbers the Tyranids bring to bear. They will also take an active role in this absorption, using the massive tendrils that reach out from their central pillars to absorb any additional biomass within reach, be it flora or fauna, as well as filtering the planet's atmosphere. Horrifyingly, they even go so far as to absorb the microbial biomass present in the atmosphere they filter, using anything and everything they can to keep their numbers strong. Along the battle lines, Termagants and Hormagants press the assault, with the former using ranged and the latter melee-focused bioweaponry to engage the opposition. These, along with other Gaunt variants, can often be seen accompanying Tyranid warriors, who can then coordinate these swarms of Gaunt genus bioforms, swarms that can sometimes be hundreds of bioforms strong. However, there are instances where overwhelming numbers aren't enough. In these scenarios, the hive mind will direct larger strains into the fray. It is during the assault phase where the hive mind will most frequently alter the micro-elements of its strategy. Planets with especially powerful defenses can sometimes see the growth and deployment of especially large Bio-Titan strains, so named because they've been seen to be comparable in size to the massive mechanical gargantuans known as Imperial Titans. These massive creatures, like the living artillery battery the Dactylus, can rain down toxic and acidic death from an immense distance, swoop over enemy defenses to bring swarming death from above like the Herodans, the broodmothers of the flying gargoyles, or simply act as living battering rams the way the Hierophants do. Sometimes, when a particular defensive point seems insurmountable, the hive mind may have certain strains such as Raveners burrow beneath defenders to attack them from behind their own lines, or have airborne strains such as Shrikes, Harpies, and the aforementioned Gargoyles assault the opposition from above. Whatever the tactic used, the one constant among them all is that while the swarm will readily sacrifice hundreds or even thousands of bioforms to achieve its goal, it always endeavors to avoid doing so needlessly. As such, the hive mind will frequently alter its strategies, often spawning new bioforms to support them. This constant adaptation stands as yet another sign of the Tyranids' mastery over evolution. For creatures with such sharp teeth and claws, though, the Tyranids rarely eat the victims they leave behind during their assaults. Instead, they leave massive swathes of refuse in their wake, fields upon fields of dead to be consumed by the next wave of bioforms during the fourth stage of the invasion, suppression. While the more militant bioforms continue to battle against the planet's defenders, others sweep up behind them, collecting all available biomass that's left behind, and yes, that does include Tyranid biomass as well. Nothing is wasted in the swarm. This means that, by this point, the planet's own natural resources have effectively been turned against it, as a portion of the gathered biomass is used to continue bolstering the front lines or expand the number of gatherer bioforms, such as the maggot-like rippers. However, the majority of the biomass is set aside to feed the hive ships orbiting the planet. And speaking of rippers, as the fighting continues along the battle lines, thousands upon thousands of these small, wriggling, toothy monstrosities are deployed from the sky in massive and tight-packed swarms. Once on the battlefield, they begin the process of devouring every organic substance they can find, living or dead, until they've eaten everything they can. They'll then drag their now bloated bodies to the digestive pools formed by the capillary towers. However, rather than regurgitating the devoured biomass into these acidic pools, the rippers will instead throw themselves in to be digested along with everything they've devoured. Once again, nothing is wasted in the swarm. This process is then repeated with new rippers being bred, sometimes with slightly altered strains to consume oceanic or subterranean life, devouring their fill, flinging themselves into the digestive pools, then being bred again to do the same. During this time, more capillary towers will also grow, many sprouting from the planet's oceans as they continue to consume and filter in water, atmosphere, and even useful mineral deposits through their tendrils and digestive pools. At this stage, a planet is effectively dead, no longer able to be salvaged by those who once inhabited it. For the Imperium of Man, this means the only recourse left is an exterminatus, planetary destruction rained down onto the surface. That is, of course, assuming they can even reach the planet at this point. If they can't, then the invasion moves to its final stage, consumption. the prey world's defenders annihilated and the present biomass being readily consumed by Ripper swarms and capillary towers, the Hive Fleet will finish its consumption of the planet's valuable resources, once again including any remaining Tyranid bioforms. With the death of the planet's defenders, the militant bioforms find their task completed and, like the Rippers, they will return to the digestive pools around the capillary towers and hurl themselves in. From there, the Ripper swarms and a few new capillary towers will spread over the rest of the planet, consuming any and all remaining biomass. Once that's done, the capillary towers will pump the water and atmosphere up to the hive ships for storage and absorption before themselves being broken down and absorbed back into the hive fleet. What is then left is nothing but a barren rock. Stripped of everything, even its atmosphere and valuable mineral components, these dead planets are now wholly incapable of supporting life of any kind, and as such, are of no use to the swarm. And so the Hive Fleet moves on, searching for the next world it can devour, all to further propagate the survival of the swarm.
I don't know where they come from. It seems highly unlikely that they evolved naturally into what they are now. Impossible given what we know about evolution. Perhaps they are some kind of bioweapon created millennia ago by madman for some long-forgotten war. If so, I suspect that their creators soon came to regret their creation. Or perhaps they came straight from the warp. Possibly the Lords of Chaos themselves cast them up because they were too unpleasant.
There is no doubt that the Tyranids pose one of the single greatest threats the galaxy has ever faced in the 41st millennium. And yet, with as much as the Imperium has learned about this new and horrible threat, still very little is actually known about them. And considering their nature, most especially the rapidity with which they can evolve, it's doubtful much will ever be learned about them or where they came from. That being said, there is one interesting hypothesis I've heard floated around about the history of the Tyranids, one that ties them in with that of the Eldar and the Orks. But be forewarned, because before we can explore this, we must first explore a brief synopsis surrounding the origins of the Orks and the Eldar. And as ridiculous as this may sound, given how information-dense this video has been so far, things are about to get even more heady. But that's enough delay. Let's just dive right into it. Millions of years before humankind even existed, much less considered taking to the stars, the Milky Way was home to a race of godlike beings called the Old Ones. These beings found themselves in an eternal struggle with what the Eldar call the Great Enemy. That enemy being the deathless Necron race and the cruel gods that subjugated them, the Catan, also known as the Star Gods. The Old Ones were a race of beings that essentially considered themselves to be the progenitors and protectors of life. So when the Necron forces began spreading across the galaxy, slaughtering all in their path so their agonized life force could feed the sinister and voracious Catan, the Old Ones acted and developed two species to fight this threat, the Eldar and the Orks. The thinking here was relatively simple. Develop these two races with different strengths in terms of combat and different skills that they could utilize in order to stymie the spread of the Necrons and, hopefully, reverse it. For the Orks, that strength was their inbred lust for combat as well as, well, their physical and imposing strength and stature. This was also combined with an ability to rapidly breed asexually by sporing in the areas where they existed, in essence making it almost impossible to fully remove an Ork threat once it has arrived on a planet. The Eldar had a much different approach taken with them. They were made to be highly psychically active and incredibly intelligent, and as such, after the war against the Necrons was ended, they formed the largest empire ever to exist in the galaxy before they had their great fall. But we're getting a little off topic here. Now, before we move into the hypothesis in question, I want to note how quickly it was that the Old Ones managed to develop the Eldar and Ork races, because this ties in directly with why this hypothesis exists. It also indicates just how talented the Old Ones were when it came to genetic engineering in their own right, as these two races were fully evolved within only the span of a few thousand years. When you consider that natural evolution usually takes millions upon millions of years, this developmental speed is absolutely immense. And thus we get the two key ties that may relate the Old Ones to the Tyranids. The hypothesis goes as follows. Like the Orks and the Eldar, the Tyranids were created by the Old Ones as a countermeasure against their great enemy, the Necrons. But where the Orks and the Eldar were specifically designed to be able to fight against the Necrons, the Tyranids were designed to halt their advance by stripping planets of life, thus halting the ability of the Necrons to feed their Catan masters. It's also surmised they were given the ability to rapidly adapt and evolve by the Old Ones as well, who were themselves masters of such things, so that the Tyranids could constantly improve their ability to see their task done. However, as compelling as this hypothesis is, and as nicely as it seems to tie into the story of the Old Ones, I personally don't buy it. After all, the Old Ones were said to have thought of themselves as the preservers of life, so creating a species such as the Tyranids, whose entire goal is the consumption of all life on a planet to fuel their own, would go entirely against this doctrine. What's more, though the methods and reasonings are different, this would mean the goal of the Tyranids parallels that of the Necrons. They may not be feeding the souls of the dead to a host of dark star gods who delight in the taste of the agony dying creatures feel, but they are still feeding upon the body of the dead to fuel their own progress. And not just the bodies of the dead either. The Tyranids feed upon all of a planet's life and resources, scouring it completely and leaving nothing but a lifeless husk devoid even of its atmosphere. Considering this, along with the prevailing theory that the Tyranids are an extragalactic species, it seems highly unlikely they'd share an origin like that of the Orks or the Eldar. But what are your thoughts on the Great Devourer, this devastating Tyranid swarm? Whatever your thoughts are, let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, please feel free to hit that like button, subscribe and hit the bell notification icon if you would like to see more, and open the description box to follow me on social media. Minds.com in particular is the best place to get in touch with me directly outside of YouTube, as well as the best place to receive notifications of other projects I'm working on beyond my YouTube channel. Lastly, I'd like to note that I also have a BitChute page available with almost all of my content mirrored there, along with 1 or 2 pieces of exclusive content as well. And with that now said, dear friends and gamers of all stripes, my name is GM Dave. I am your man behind the screen. And I would like to wish you caution while traversing the stars, for the Great Devourer is out there, and it is hungry.